with the life of your entire family.
Exactly.
And so your daughter's life has changed how? Your older child?
We do things separately. We tag team. I go with her, or Dad goes with her to her functions. And the other one stays home with Evan. Evan rarely goes out, which is sad because you want them to have a life, go to the zoo, do the things that normal people do, if you want to call it normal.
What is a typical day in the life like with him?
I have to sleep with the one eye open because he can just get up now and go about the house and wake up sister and wake up dad. And so I try to grab him first, and then we go downstairs, and there's a demand for breakfast that he might eat, might not. Just depends on what is going to get accomplished between the time of getting up and going to school. So he's going from room to room to room. Please put your clothes on. Please put your shoes on. Please try and do these things. And he gets angry.
Good day to you. If you're like me, you're wondering, what are they talking about? What is it that they're worried about with their son or their daughter? They have a crawling ticker across the bottom of the screen, as it's called, saying, mothers talk about concerns with their children. And that particular show, I don't know if you recognize it, the host there is Megyn Kelly. She came over from Fox, and now she's on NBC, and that's what that was. And this is in the morning. It's a little after 9 o'clock today, on Thursday. And this is television. And this is what most people see. They react to TV at the level that we have just reacted to, or I have just reacted to it, wondering about the content of the show itself. But as we've demonstrated all semester long, the content that appears in media, whether it's a newspaper, or whether it's a radio station, or whether it's a television channel like that, or a web page, the content comes from a lot of different factors. What we call elements, right? We've been studying those elements all semester long. We've looked at cultural characteristics, we've looked at philosophies, we've looked at regulations, we've looked at financing, and we've looked at accessibility. And now we finally reach that part of the tree that's the most noticeable part of the tree, and that's the leaves. And so now we begin to finally talk about content in a new way. We've looked at content as a way of looking beyond the content to study a media system. Now we're going to study the content as it exists across these 8 countries and talk about how that content is manifested because of all these different elements that we've been discussing all semester long. We're going to spend 2 classes on this. In other words, well, I guess you could say it's 4 classes altogether when you consider that each class will have both a quiz and a discussion question, because we're going to really concentrate on media content as being the most important element of a media system. And when we talk about media content, it has a kind of legacy in the literature of academic research that I think is ill-defined. And I talk about that in the book. I talk about how there was a separation when talking about content that separated content from form. And whereas content would be the information that's contained inside of a media program, and that content is going to be separate from the form, which is the way that it looks. You know, the form is like the order of the information. So this is a local news section of the Pocono Record. Why is this not the front page? It's actually the second section when you go inside, and third comes sports, and fourth will come people or money, depending on the day. But the first section is going to be your main headline, sort of breaking news. So by putting local news second as form, you're saying that it's the second most important thing in the newspaper. So the old distinction between content and form, I think, is invalid because they get tangled up, because form can also be content. So in my book, I try to offer a new breakdown for studying content, and I say that content is composed of substance, which is the information contained inside of the media message, versus form, which is the way that it looks. And let's move on now to talk about the 4 countries that we're going to focus on in today's instructor video, the first one being France. And when we talk about newspapers and we start to look at the form first, we know that all of the newspapers are serious in their scope. There's no sort of light-hearted newspaper. There's no USA Today. Not that USA Today is a light-hearted newspaper per se, but it is certainly lighter than the New York Times. You don't have that in French newspapers. They are very, very serious. And there are 5 of them. You got Le Canard Enchaîné, which means the enchained duck. And that is a play on words, by the way. That same word, enchaîné, or that same word, canard, which is duck, C-A-N-A-R-D, also is a slang word for newspapers in France. And so it's the Chained Up Duck is the name of that newspaper. And that newspaper is very unusual. It has cartoons in it. 50% of the content is cartoonish looking, and it's used to tell stories about the news. A second newspaper is Le Monde. It's a newspaper that's very well known across the world. A third newspaper is L'Humanité. That's a communist newspaper. And then a fifth newspaper is Libération. Can't remember if I have my French right there. And that is a left-wing newspaper that's seeded mostly for a university audience. One of the interesting things about the form of French newspaper content is instead of using quote marks like we do, they have caret marks to set off their quotes. It's a different use of grammar. Also, advertising occupies a very small place in French newspaper. It's, in the U.S. newspaper, when you open up a newspaper, you've got half of the story on the page you're looking at, and then you've got an ad, right? Because they want you to turn the paper to look at the rest of the story on the second page so that your eyes are dragged across that ad. That's why you don't have a whole newspaper story, and you just have a lot less ads in French newspapers. Also, you don't see a lot of photographs in French newspapers. There's a lot of very much text-based newspapers. Substance-wise, you'll find a lot of the information is about the European Union. A lot of the information is about other countries from around the world. It's very easy to follow America and what's going on. They know what Donald Trump is doing every single day without having to look at American media. They can find that out in their own newspapers because those newspapers are always covering foreign events and especially European Union events. A lot of the times it is possible for you to see nudity in French newspapers, but it's not very common unless it's in an ad, which is unusual, or unless it's in artwork. But as far as in photographs for stories, no, you're not going to find that. Radio-wise, this is very interesting. They actually have a radio guide to look at radio programs that are available on the French public stations. So, just like we have a TV guide here, that most people don't use that anymore because it's an on-screen guide. You will find that there's a French magazine. It's called Télérama. And you get this magazine. You can look through the magazine. You can find out what kinds of radio programs are on. It's not going to just be a station that is just playing rock and roll. You're going to have at 7 o'clock an interview with Rod Stewart, for example. Or at 12 o'clock, you're going to have an interview with an author on a book. And you can look that up, and people plan their day according to that. Also, form-wise for radio, programs don't begin just at the top of the hour and just at the bottom of the hour. They can begin really at almost every minute and end at almost every minute, but most of the times it's in 5-minute increments. So a program might begin at 7:05 in the morning, 7:15, 7:30. Again, that's because, in part, in the U.S., our programming is driven by advertisements, and the advertisers don't want you to miss watching another TV show or listening to another radio program because one has already started and you don't like that, but it's too late to get into the other one because that one is already 5 minutes into it as well. No, times are staggered in France. When it comes to the substance of radio formats, we've already discussed this a little bit in a prior instructor video, but they have all of these, in addition to commercial radio, they have all of these French public radio channels. So they've got France Culture, they've got France Information, they've got France Inter, which does pop, rock, and jazz. They've got France Musique, which does classical and contemporary classical music with discussion. And then they have commercial radio. So they have a really wide variety of radio content. TV-wise, similar to radio, TV listings are also published in that Télérama magazine. When you look at the TV landscape, terrestrial landscape, that means channels that broadcast, you've got 5 national networks. 3 of them are commercial. 2 of them are state-owned. So there's a balance there, but it's slightly in favor of commercialism because you have 3 French terrestrial commercial broadcasters and 2 state-owned ones. And there is that one state-owned channel that is shared with Germany as a state-owned channel. It's a France 5 on the French side, and it's Arte on the German side, and they both contribute programming to that channel. And once again, programs can start at almost any time of the day, but most commonly 5 minutes in 5-minute increments. When it comes to genres, you know, you can find almost anything on French television, but three genres that are very, very common. One is a magazine program, and this is a 2-hour program, 2 hours, right, where they do 4 to 5 stories, and they go in depth with each of those stories. And so they might follow a former French military officer who is now living in the colony of Mali in Africa. Sorry, Mali is not a colony, it's a state or a country in Africa. You know, that may not be of interest to you, but spending 2 hours and getting into that kind of micro detail on French culture is very typical of French programming. A second genre that's very common is the parody comedy. The parody comedy is where they have puppets who are acting out politicians. So they'll take somebody like Donald Trump or before him, Barack Obama, and they will caricature that person. They'll really exaggerate things like that, make really big eyebrows on Donald Trump, and they'll really make the hair, you know, much more extreme than Donald Trump's hair is. And then they'll use those characters to mimic parts of their personality that are both troublesome and also are something to be studied. You know, kind of like Saturday Night Live does with Alec Baldwin. And then the third genre that they have in French television is the telefilm. And that's a 1.5 hour, not 1 hour, not 2 hours, 1.5 hour. It's a murder mystery. So we have a lot of those shows as well, but they usually run an hour long. On French television, nudity is very common. You can say pretty much you're going to see it every single night of the week. And the nudity is not just limited to female toplessness as it is in other countries. You actually will see male genitalia. Now, you're not going to see an erection. You're not going to see what's officially codified in the French regulation as penetration, but you will see sexual scenes in France. And in fact, to go around the French countryside, you see statues that are naked with all of the genitals filled in detail, almost wherever you go. So it's just part and parcel of the country. When France brings in a program that's from another country, like the U.S. and Britain are the two main sources of programming. Also, Germany provides programming also. What France will do is they will take the soundtrack and they will do away with it, and then they'll put their own voices in, their own characters, their own actors, delivering French language to the American visuals. And that's very unique, not completely unique, but it's very unique, especially to countries like France where there is a concern about the language being diluted. And so they want to make sure that they don't provide any more opportunities for English to infiltrate the French culture. Moving on now to Sweden. Sweden, when we talk about newspapers, the form of the newspapers is they have 7 national newspapers, 7 for a small country with 8 million people, and 4 of those newspapers are broadsheets. These are the morning newspapers that we called them earlier, the morning papers, and they are very, very serious, very politically inclined. One of them in each major city is going to be funded by the government, subsidized, right, to be a competitor to the main newspaper. But then you also have 3 other afternoon newspapers in Sweden. Those are the tabloids, and they're coming out with the sensational stories. There's a very clean look to Swedish newspapers. In fact, the tabloids are stapled. Yes, you can't pull apart a tabloid newspaper like you can in New York City or England, in Sweden. In Sweden, they're all stapled down the middle. It's a very neat and orderly society. Substance-wise, one thing that's unique about Swedish newspapers in terms of the morning newspapers is they have what are called the debate pages. And on those debate pages, they're going to have an issue that's debated across 5 days. So not just handled on one particular day of a newspaper and then they move on to another subject. They'll take one particular day. Like right now, for example, in the U.S., there's a big spending bill that's going to pass before Friday, and that spending bill is going to provide money for, among other things, it's going to provide money for part of the money is going to go for the building a wall between us and Mexico, although it's nowhere near as much as President Trump has said that he wants. But let's take that issue about erecting a wall between two cultures. You would find that discussed on the debate pages. So Monday, you will have a prominent politician arguing in favor of it. Tuesday, you will have somebody arguing against it. Wednesday, you may have a citizen who's taking a different point of view that combines both of the previous 2 point of views. There's a national debate that goes on in these Swedish newspapers. In newspapers in Sweden, also nudity is very common. There's a photograph in the book that you would not see in I venture to say, any other country. There's a photograph in a Swedish newspaper in the book for this class of a cesarean section taking place, and it shows a woman's belly with a baby's foot coming out of it. Now, that would just make a lot of people cringe in the United States, but in Sweden, that's fair game. That's part and parcel to Swedish culture. They're open culture. They talk about things very directly, and so putting a photograph like that on front page is no problem. Also, you'll find profanity is very, very common. You have young people in Sweden writing letters in, and the female will say, all my boyfriend wants to do is F-U-C-K me. You'll actually see that in a Swedish newspaper, and then you have this psychologist slash advice columnist who's going to respond to that. It's interesting. That's the way that people talk, and that's being represented in Swedish newspapers. On the radio side of things, similar to France, you've got radio listings under form of radio. You've got radio listings that are published once again, but not in the magazine like France, but they are published in newspapers. And so it's another reason that people buy newspapers, because they want to look up what radio programs they want to listen to later in the day. Maybe there's going to be a documentary on Laplanders. These are people that live way in the north of Sweden in the Arctic Circle, and they live in the most severe icy conditions. And maybe you're going to have a radio program on that, and that's going to be very interesting to Swedes. And so you'll see that listed in the newspaper. On the state regulated governments, on the state funded radio stations, no advertisement whatsoever. But on commercial radio, you do have commercials. It makes sense on commercial radio, but there's very limited advertising minutage, as we've discussed in the past. And of those public stations, you've got all these Ps, as they're called, P1, P2, P3, P4, all the way up through P7. And I'm not going to read them all out. It'll sound like a grocery list, but you've got all different genres of radio content that's offered on these Ps. When it comes to television, again, TV programs can start at any time during the hour, most commonly in 5-minute increments, 5 after, 10 after, etc. And Sweden also has this unique feature. They kind of have like a TV DJ, if you want to think of it that way, that is in between programs, because the programs are not squeezed by advertising where every second counts. They actually have time for a person to finish up one program, even if it's a comedy, even if it's a drama. This is a person who works for the network, is like an anchor in a way, comes on and talks about what that was about, and then just in a minute, and then the next program that comes up is previewed by this anchor as well. The VJ, if you want to think of it that way, is acting as a bridge between programs. Very, very unique. One of the channels, by the way, channel 5, is coming from Denmark. So Sweden is actually borrowing programming from Denmark. Now, when it comes to unique genres in television, nature documentaries are huge. I can remember watching a nature documentary that followed a group of people that went fishing. And as part of the Swedish culture, like I mentioned before, they go in the sauna and they're all sitting there naked. And then they go out and they get into the lake, and they go and they close their pores off and they get in the cooled water and they're refreshed, and they show them drinking. So it's very, very different, these nature documentaries that you see in Sweden. Another genre that you see in Sweden is what I call the talk/variety/sing-along program. It would be like having an Oprah Winfrey program or a Dr. Phil program, except at some point they're going to sing with the audience. I mean, I guess you can say Ellen DeGeneres does that. She dances with her audience a little bit, but this is actually they sing, and they sing old Swedish folk songs. Content-wise on television, you will not find much violence, not much graphic violence at all. If you're going to find violence in Swedish television, it's going to be on news programs when they cover a war, or when they cover a story about a person who has been a victim of crime, like a murder. Then you're going to see violence. But as far as your average action film or drama, you're not going to have violence. Sweden really shies away from violence. On the other hand, you will have nudity. And actually, Sweden has the most graphic sexual nudity out of any of the countries in the book. One day I was watching Swedish television. It was a talk show, like this variety talk show, and they were getting ready to end the show, and all of a sudden the host stands up, and the person I was with is translating for me, and the host said something in Swedish, and then I looked to the person I was next to, and they said, "Oh, he's just said, kids out of the room, porn." I said, "What?" And the next thing I know, I see, I guess you would call it classic pornography from the 1920s or 30s. I don't know when it was from. It's black and white. And they were showing that on Swedish television. That's part of Sweden. They talk about everything. They're open with everything. All right, now we're going to move on to, going to talk about the UK now. Form-wise, for newspapers, you've got 10 national newspapers, the most out of any of the countries that we've talked about before. 5 of them are tabloids. Some would even say screaming tabloids. If you want to know what I mean, go look up The Sun. Just Google it online, look at The Sun, and you will see the kinds of headlines that you will find there. So you got 5 tabloids, and then you've got 5 broadsheets. And each of these broadsheets, the journalism is just fabulous. When I lived in England, I used to just pore over newspapers. I'd buy 3, 4, 5, and I would sit there and I read them because the journalism is so interesting. And part of that is because they use irony and double meanings in their journalism. So it's always trying to entice the reader to try and figure things out. When you see a double meaning, you try to figure out what that other meaning is. So British journalism is very interactive with its audience. Also, you see a lot of ads in British newspaper, lots of photographs. Britain has a big paparazzi, people going around trying to take photographs, not too many cartoons or graphics. Substance-wise, in newspapers, you have current events, and then you have business, and then when it comes to sports, like other countries, you're going to find differences: football, rugby, cricket, and horse racing. Those are the big sports in the UK. Not football, obviously, not soccer. When I say football, I mean soccer football. I don't mean American football. I don't mean baseball. There's also a lot of coverage about the EU's relationship to Britain, and I assume especially so now since Britain is exiting from the EU. And then when it comes to the tabloids, substance-wise, there's usually a lot of stories about sexual improprieties, especially between football players, soccer players. And then you've got a lot of talk about drinking. There's constantly talking about people drinking in pubs and then doing silly things afterwards. And even drugs are covered. Crime is covered, but when it's covered, it mostly focuses on the suffering that the victims go through. In British newspapers, you will also find profanity. You will find somebody reviewing somebody's latest music release, and if they don't like it, they'll say it's SHIT, and they'll put that right in the newspaper. When it comes to radio, once again, you've got radio listings that are listed in a publication. This time it is back to a magazine format like France. This one is called Radio Times. And most radio programs do begin, once again, at 5 after the hour, 10 after the hour, etc. On commercial stations, there's a lot of advertising. On non-commercial stations, the BBC stations, no advertising at all. When it comes to substance, you don't really find the radio format like you find in the United States. You won't find the rock and roll format. You won't find the jazz format. You won't find the top 40 format. Radio is much more eclectic in Britain and Sweden as well. So you might have Pink, the artist Pink, followed by an Elvis Presley song, followed by an Ed Sheeran song. It's going to be very typical in Britain. A lot of American music is going to be heard on British radio, although here in America we have a lot of British performers like Ed Sheeran. When it comes to substance, sorry, I've been talking about substance. You also have a lot of programs that involve analysis and discussion of politics, discussion of literature, discussion of the arts, discussion of science, discussion. There's a lot of talk in Britain trying to get to the bottom and understand things. Profanity is pretty regular, not as much as in Sweden, I would say, but you will find a lot of profanity in songs that are just played on radio because that's the way the songs were cut. Even on BBC radio, you'll find those programs. They're not censored any more than commercial programs. On the television side of things, programs again start at 5 after, 10 after, 15 hour. On the BBC channels, no ads at all. And in fact, on the commercial channels, ads are forbidden to be placed between certain programs, like children's programs. You can't end a children's program and then have ads for anything that's related to what children might pressure their parents to provide. When it comes to substance on TV, much of the content is geared towards teaching the audience something. It's in British culture. We talked about how literate it is because of all the reading they do. They rarely like to look at something just simply because it's entertaining. There's usually something they want to learn from. So the documentary is a very popular genre, and so is the intellectual quiz show. The shows that we have in the U.S., like Wheel of Fortune, for example, or the one that Snoop Dogg is doing now. Can't remember the name of it. Those are really lightweight when it comes to knowledge, and most of the knowledge is about popular culture figures. If you watch, the exception in America is Jeopardy, but even that show would be considered somewhat light compared to the intellectual program. So what they'll do is they'll match up Oxford versus Cambridge, and they'll have students from both of those universities, which are the most prestigious universities, and they'll have them compete with knowledge. And I'll tell you what, as a TV audience member, if you can get one question right, you really feel like you've accomplished something. Also, what you will find is violence is pretty common. British programming is some of the most violent. You can see blood. You can hear sounds of people when they're getting beat up. Britain is very graphic when it comes to violence. Nudity is very common, just like France. You'll find it almost every single night. If two people are in a romantic relationship and there are calls for them to go into the bedroom for a scene, they're going to show the bodies of these people. It's very, very common. And sometimes you even find nakedness in the news if it's appropriate. If they're covering a sporting event and a streaker runs out onto the field, they'll show that on the news. Now we'll move to the final country, the USA. We think we know what our content is like, but do we? Let's talk about newspapers first. When it comes to form, most newspapers in the United States are broadsheets. Most newspapers are broadsheets, and that's because that newspaper is delivered to the home. We talked about that earlier. The newspaper delivery, and it's going to go right on the counter, just like this one here. So you have plenty of room to open it up and spread it out. Okay, so tabloids, they're popular in the big cities like New York. You can find the Daily News, for example, because people have tight spaces to read them on subways, etc. Excuse me. Yeah, but you don't have as many tabloids as you will find in the European countries. Also, when it comes to the U.S., advertising is huge, right? It's huge in almost every medium, and newspapers is no exception. And so when you look at a newspaper, sometimes you wonder, where are the stories? And in fact, the advertising in American newspapers is actually laid out before the stories are. So first you decide where the McDonald's ad is going to go, the Geico ad, and then you decide where you're going to put the newspaper stories. When it comes to substance, we have what's called a prestige press. And those are newspapers that are seen to be above the others in terms of leading with the stories that other newspapers, smaller newspapers, local and regional newspapers pick up on. So you can probably guess what these are. We've got the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Those are the leading newspapers in this country. And substance-wise, you will see a lot of crime and a lot of drama, a lot of talk about heroes. Even in this story right here, in this Pocono Record newspaper story, Stroudsburg coach's resignation stirs uproar. So this is focusing on a person who may have been wrongly fired and a person who, as a coach, was admired by many parents. It's putting a person in the position of being a hero kind of character. Profanity in the U.S., you're not going to find it in most newspapers, although it's slightly changing. You may find some very, very simple examples, like the word shit you might find in a newspaper, but generally speaking, it's going to be hard to find. And there's no nudity in American newspapers. On the radio side of things, listings for radio stations don't really exist unless you go to a website for the radio station and find it. Pretty much you know what the format of the station is when you go to listen to it, or you're willing to wait for it until you hear the song. There are multiple ad breaks on radio. Ads are taking place almost every few minutes, it seems. And that causes most radio hosts to have a very brisk pace to their talk. They're speaking very fast. They're not speaking in a regular conversational pace or speaking in a way to get as much information as they can in. Format-wise, we have niche formats. I mean, when you think about it, rock and roll is a very niche format because it could encompass a lot of different kinds of music, but it's usually focused on hits from the 90s and the 2000s, or hits from 10 years ago, or current hits. That's how narrow our radio formats are. And of course, profanity is bleeped out. That's a whole other subject that I address in another one of my journal articles. What happens when you bleep out profanity? It actually invites the audience to fill in. Let me figure out what that word is, where I heard the F and then I hear the beep. Let me figure that. Not too tough to figure out, right? So you actually get more involved. That's the point of my paper. More involved than if you just let the word play. But at any rate, you won't find profanity in its full form on radio, unless you're listening to satellite radio. TV-wise, programs are almost always beginning at the top and the bottom of the hour. And most programs are actually 18 to 22 minutes long once you take the ads out. And that means that the programs that are what's left of the content that's not advertising content is always having to be edited down to make room for that advertising comment. So when you listen to a person being interviewed, the soundbite often cuts their sentence off in the middle and you don't get to hear their full thought. And that's just one example of compressing the content because of the ads that exist. Substance-wise, on American television, the vast majority is commercial and entertainment oriented. Cultural programs are few and far between, and even of what we call cultural programs is very different. I was looking at WVIA, which is a PBS station, public broadcasting station, and they were showing a concert of the Rolling Stones two nights ago. That's why I was watching it. I wanted to see the Stones. Very rare concert from Hollywood in California, where they played the entire Sticky Fingers album from 1971. But that's not really high culture. If that was in a European country, the public station would be airing opera, or it would be airing a symphony, or some other upper echelon dimension of the arts. In the U.S., we have a couple unique genres. We've got the televangelist sermon on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings. These people that have these monstrous audiences, and they're trying to get money from them and speak the word of God, and it's also being broadcast on television. And similar to that, you've got the infomercial. It's an advertisement that runs an entire half hour long just trying to sell you a product for your kitchen household. And actually, when you look at the cable side of things, we have channels that are just dedicated to purchasing things, which is QVC. So we have a lot of commercialism in American television. Profanity-wise, you won't find profanity. That may change in the future. What we get is a lot of teasing, right? If two people, if they embrace and they take their clothes off, the woman turns away from the camera and you see her back. Or the man turns away and you see from the bottom of the spine up to the top. You don't see nudity. You'll find nudity on premium channels. You find plenty of it on streaming services like Netflix, etc. But in terrestrial American television, it's still part of the forbidden zone. So that's going to start our first discussion of media content covering the first 4 countries in this chapter. And we'll pick up the next 4 countries the next time we have this same lecture 1 week from today. Have a great day.